Terrence Robinson woke before dawn, the Georgia sky still thick with night. He moved quietly through his modest home in Atlanta, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the morning stillness. His daughter, Alyssa, stirred at the smell of oatmeal with brown sugar, and his son, Marcus, blinked sleep from his eyes. He packed their lunches, kissed their foreheads, and walked them to the bus stop. At 5:00 a.m., Terrence drove to the construction site where he poured concrete for a living. His hands, scarred and calloused, gripped the wheel and the trowel with equal familiarity. Life had been quiet since his wife died in a car accident 2 years earlier. He juggled work, parenting, and coaching Little League with disciplined calm. Then everything changed one Tuesday evening in October. Harold Gaines, a white businessman, was found dead behind the site. Police discovered work gloves with Terrence's name on the inside. No witnesses, no weapon. That simple evidence set the chain of events in motion. Detective Ray Sullivan, under pressure from local authorities and a senator, arrested Terrence. His children watched in silence as officers handcuffed their father. At the county jail, a man named Derek Sims, serving time on unrelated charges, claimed Terrence had confessed. Sims had been coached by Sullivan in exchange for a reduced sentence. The false testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution. The trial moved quickly. Judge Catherine Whitfield, a 30-year veteran with a family legacy in Braden County, ran her courtroom with absolute authority. She overruled every defense objection, denied a requested 3-week continuance, and allowed prejudicial character evidence. Terrence's lawyer, Paul Chambers, overwhelmed and under-resourced, could do little. In 4 days, Terrence was sentenced to death. The judge's voice was flat, her hands clean of empathy. His mother, Naomi, collapsed in the gallery. In his cell, Terrence did not break. He retrieved a pen, sat on the concrete floor, and began writing. He drafted motions, appeals, and letters, drawing on a legal education he had set aside years earlier after his wife's death. He had graduated top of his class from Howard University School of Law, passed the Georgia bar at the top of his cohort, and interned at the federal prosecutor's office. Life had forced him to put law aside, but it never left him. Over weeks, he meticulously built his case, contacting Sims to recant, filing for DNA testing, and collecting evidence of judicial bias and misconduct. When the day came to present his case in federal court, Terrence stood alone, calm, articulate, and precise. His voice described his daily life, the events of the trial, and the deliberate failures of the court. He revealed new DNA evidence exonerating him and exposed the perjury and systemic bias that had condemned him. The courtroom, once skeptical, listened in stunned silence. Terrence Robinson, once a concrete worker, was a force of law and reason, confronting decades of injustice with clarity and resolve. And somewhere in the gallery, his mother Naomi closed her eyes, breathing hope into a story that had long awaited justice. The federal courtroom was tense, sunlight streaming through high windows, dust motes floating like tiny witnesses. Terrence Robinson began methodically detailing the procedural errors of his original trial. His first point was the 6:30 a.m. hearing, which forced his elderly mother, Naomi, to navigate 2 buses in the dark. The second was the denial of a 3-week continuance that could have allowed independent testing of the gloves. Third, he described how prejudicial character evidence had been admitted, painting him as a single father from a poor neighborhood rather than focusing on the facts. Fourth, he exposed the jailhouse informant, Derek Sims, who lied under pressure for a reduced sentence. Fifth, he recounted the suppression of cross-examination regarding Sims's plea deal, leaving the jury unaware of motivation to lie. Sixth, he noted Judge Whitfield never addressed him by name, treating him as a defendant number rather than a man. Terrence's voice was calm, yet each point struck like a gavel. The courtroom leaned in. Even Judge Whitfield shifted uneasily in her chair. Terrence then turned to evidence. He showed photographs of the gloves, explaining he wore them daily, making DNA presence meaningless. He presented the lab results from 2 independent laboratories, confirming the blood did not belong to the victim, Harold Gaines, but to a man named Curtis Doyle, a violent individual previously uninvestigated. The courtroom gasped. Crawford, the judge's attorney, tried to regain control, objecting to the admissibility of new evidence, but Judge Abrams allowed it. Terrence called Sims to the stand. With hands shaking, Sims admitted to fabricating the confession under guidance from Detective Sullivan. The man had lied to save himself. The gallery was silent, the weight of truth settling in. Terrence then revealed a comprehensive analysis of Whitfield's sentencing patterns over 30 years, demonstrating that black defendants received disproportionately harsher sentences than white defendants for similar crimes. In 14 capital cases, 13 death sentences went to black men. Finally, he presented an affidavit from retired Detective Sullivan detailing political and personal pressure applied to secure a conviction against him. Whitfield was pale, her composure cracking. Terrence had dismantled decades of systemic bias, case by case, evidence by evidence. Every piece of data, every sworn statement, every precedent was meticulously documented. The courtroom held its collective breath as Terrence concluded, leaving silence heavy in the air. His mother, Naomi, clutched her hands tightly, praying without words. The truth, long suppressed, had finally found its voice. Terrence's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension around him. A man once condemned, now wielding knowledge as his instrument of justice. The legal machine that had failed him for so long was being held accountable in real time, and the room could sense the magnitude of what was unfolding. Terrence Robinson was not merely presenting an appeal. He was exposing the very rot that had threatened lives for decades. Terrence shifted seamlessly into his own personal narrative, recounting his life before the trial. He described the empty mornings after his wife's death, the ache of balancing construction work and parenting alone, and the quiet discipline it took to maintain stability for Alyssa and Marcus. His words painted the ordinary heroism of a man doing everything for the ones he loved. The courtroom hung on every detail. He explained that he had set aside his law career out of necessity, not lack of ability, and now that knowledge fueled his defense. Terrence methodically reconstructed the sequence of his arrest, describing his children's silent shock, the officer's efficiency, and the psychological weight of being stripped of agency. He illustrated how a single false statement, guided by self-interest from Derek Sims and facilitated by systemic pressure, had sealed his fate. Every choice, every suppression of evidence, every overlooked motion became a thread in the tapestry of injustice he was unraveling. Then he detailed his meticulous work from prison, drafting motions, researching precedents, filing FOIA requests, and corresponding with witnesses. He had converted a cell into a command center for legal strategy, every page handwritten, every citation precise. Terrence's calm, deliberate tone contrasted with the enormity of the revelations. The jurors leaned forward, the spectators still, and even Judge Whitfield's expression betrayed a flicker of unease. He held up his handwritten appeal, now a compendium of evidence, witness affidavits, lab reports, and historical analysis of sentencing patterns, demonstrating a clear pattern of racial bias and procedural violations. Terrence then began to expose the systemic factors, the local political pressures, the district attorney's office complicity, and Whitfield's decades-long history of disproportionate sentencing against black defendants. Every number, every fact, every sworn affidavit reinforced the narrative of injustice. The court was silent, absorbing the weight of a life nearly destroyed by a flawed system. Terrence paused, allowing the courtroom to internalize the human cost, not just the legal violations. He described his mother's unwavering support, the letters, the daily calls, and the emotional endurance it had taken to maintain hope. Each anecdote underscored not weakness, but resilience, patience, and moral clarity. By the time Terrence returned to the evidence, the momentum had shifted. The courtroom was no longer just observing, it was witnessing the reclamation of a man's life and dignity. He presented the DNA reports, the recantation of Sims, and the statistical analysis of Whitfield's sentencing records, each element hitting with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The story was both deeply personal and systematically indicting. The gallery, lawyers, and judges alike were captivated by the juxtaposition of quiet strength and irrefutable facts. Terrence had constructed a narrative that combined meticulous legal argument with human truth, a fusion of intellect and lived experience that made it impossible to ignore. Terrence's next move was surgical. He began cross-examining Judge Whitfield, shifting the courtroom from passive observation to active reckoning. Calmly, he asked her to recall black defendants she had presided over, highlighting her inability to name any from thousands of cases, yet she could recall white defendants effortlessly. Each question illuminated decades of implicit bias, and the courtroom witnessed an institution unraveling under quiet scrutiny. Terrence pressed further. Why deny the continuance? Why allow testimony from an uncorroborated informant? Why ignore conflicts of interest, including political connections with Senator Hal Dawson? Whitfield's silence was telling, her composure cracking under the weight of precise inquiry. He methodically read names, sentences, and disparities, letting facts speak louder than accusations. Each statistic, each recounted decision, painted the pattern of systemic injustice. The gallery absorbed the gravity. Jurors exchanged glances, spectators whispered, and even Whitfield seemed momentarily lost, realizing the scrutiny she had avoided for 30 years now demanded reckoning. Terrence did not flinch. He stood calm, eyes steady, voice measured. He had reconstructed his life, the trial, and the machinery of oppression, revealing a courtroom designed to deliver conviction rather than justice. As he finished this segment, the weight of his narrative hung in the air. The court sensed a turning point, not just for him, but for every person whose fate had been shaped by unchecked authority and procedural manipulation. The human cost, now tied irrevocably to concrete evidence and lived experience, was undeniable. Terrence paused, letting the silence underscore the magnitude of what he had exposed. Naomi Robinson's hands were clasped in quiet prayer, tears flowing silently. The courtroom, from spectators to seasoned lawyers, felt the tension shift. What had been presumed order was now a fragile facade. Terrence had laid the groundwork for the ultimate reveal, the evidence that would prove his innocence and dismantle the biases that had threatened his life. Terrence moved to the pivotal evidence, the work gloves. Holding a photograph for the gallery to see, he explained that he wore them every day at the construction site. His DNA being present was natural, not criminal. Then he revealed the small bloodstain on the left palm, which had never been tested during the original trial. Independent labs, commissioned through his prison appeals, confirmed it belonged to Curtis Doyle, a violent man with a history of assault who had never been investigated. The room reacted, a collective intake of breath. He then called Derek Sims to the stand. The man, visibly shaken, admitted he had fabricated Terrence's supposed confession under direction from Detective Sullivan in exchange for a reduced sentence. The courtroom was silent, the truth cutting through layers of deception. Terrence then presented a detailed analysis of Whitfield's sentencing patterns over 30 years, showing stark racial disparities in death penalty cases and systemic bias against black defendants. Every number, every citation reinforced his narrative. He concluded this segment with an affidavit from retired Detective Sullivan, confirming pressure from political figures and highlighting Judge Whitfield's insistence on a conviction over justice. Whitfield's hands gripped the table, her composure visibly cracking. The gallery, lawyers, and judges alike absorbed the gravity. The institution's failures were now undeniable. Terrence's calm precision transformed him from defendant to authority, wielding knowledge and evidence as instruments of truth. Even Crawford, Whitfield's attorney, faltered, realizing the courtroom was no longer on his side. Terrence had systematically dismantled decades of injustice and false narrative, compelling every person present to confront the human and institutional cost of their assumptions. Terrence then addressed the courtroom directly, recounting the personal cost of the miscarriage of justice. He described missing milestones, Alyssa losing her first tooth, Marcus hitting his first home run, and his mother's surgeries that he could not attend. Each detail humanized the stakes, showing that the trial's procedural failures had devastating ripple effects on real lives. His tone was steady, neither pleading nor angry, but full of undeniable gravity. He emphasized the systematic nature of the injustice, the district attorney's office failing to monitor Whitfield's patterns, the state bar ignoring complaints, and political figures influencing outcomes. Then he turned to Judge Whitfield, outlining the clear breaches of ethics and law, with each question punctuating decades of misconduct. He detailed every ruling, every denied motion, every suppressed piece of evidence, painting a mosaic of bias and procedural negligence. Whitfield could not answer. Her authority crumbled under precise scrutiny. Terrence's final points connected the personal to the institutional, the human cost of systemic bias, the denial of due process, and the racial disparities in sentencing. Every fact, every affidavit, every lab report reinforced the inevitable conclusion. The courtroom sat in rapt silence as he paused, letting the evidence and testimony settle, preparing the space for the final revelation that would fully exonerate him and hold decades of misconduct accountable. Terrence shifted focus to the legal expertise that had been dormant for years. He explained his law degree from Howard University, graduating top of his class, passing the Georgia State Bar in the top 2%, and completing an internship at the federal prosecutor's office. The courtroom absorbed the revelation. The man in a prison jumpsuit, once presumed incapable, possessed the legal acumen to dismantle the case against him. He detailed how he had used this knowledge to meticulously draft motions, appeals, and petitions from his death row cell. Each document was handwritten, flawless, citing statutes, precedents, and federal regulations. Terrence showed how he had secured DNA retesting of the work gloves, obtained affidavits from key witnesses, and collected data demonstrating Judge Whitfield's systematic bias. The courtroom witnessed the convergence of lived experience and legal mastery. He described contacting Derek Sims, who had perjured himself, and guiding him to recant voluntarily. Terrence explained how he obtained the sentencing data and federal affidavits that exposed political and procedural pressure in his original trial. Each piece of evidence was interconnected, forming an irrefutable narrative of injustice. He paused, letting the gravity settle. The gallery, spectators, and even Whitfield herself were fully engaged. Terrence Robinson, a concrete worker, a widowed father, and a man nearly executed for a crime he did not commit, now stood as a sovereign force of law and justice, systematically revealing the flaws, biases, and corruption that had endangered his life. The courtroom, once rigid in protocol, was now a theater of accountability, where truth held sway over assumption, and every observer understood the extraordinary depth of preparation and courage Terrence had employed to reclaim his life. With the courtroom now fully attentive, Terrence returned to the sequence of decisions that had condemned him. He revisited the denied continuance, the admission of prejudicial character evidence, and the reliance on Sims's false testimony. Each example demonstrated the calculated disregard for due process and the appearance of impartiality. He then highlighted the independent DNA results, proving Curtis Doyle's blood on the gloves, the unreliability of the jailhouse informant, and the chain of political pressure from Senator Hal Dawson. Terrence methodically connected every procedural failure to its human consequence: the lost moments with his children, the anguish of his mother, and the years of fear on death row. The courtroom remained still. Even the guards leaned in, sensing the profound weight of his narrative. Finally, he outlined the data confirming Judge Whitfield's systemic bias, juxtaposing white and black sentencing disparities, and showing the extreme consequences for black defendants in capital cases. Every statistic, affidavit, and motion illustrated not just his innocence, but a pattern of abuse that had persisted for decades. Terrence's calm, precise voice carried the weight of truth, while his unwavering presence exposed the human cost of systemic injustice. By the time he concluded, every person in the courtroom understood that they had witnessed not just an appeal, but a reckoning, a deliberate unmasking of decades-long failures and corruption, and the extraordinary resolve of a man reclaiming his life. Terrence moved to the final pieces of his argument, focusing on the human consequences of Judge Whitfield's systemic misconduct. He recounted the anguish of his children, Alyssa and Marcus, growing up without their father present during critical milestones. He described his mother, Naomi, enduring each day of uncertainty, her heart tethered to a son wrongly condemned. Terrence emphasized that this was not a singular injustice. It reflected a pattern of institutional failures, political influence, and racial bias that persisted unchecked. He methodically presented sworn affidavits, lab reports, and statistical analyses to connect each procedural violation to tangible human suffering. The courtroom was silent, the weight of decades of abuse now undeniable. He reminded the court that Whitfield's rulings were not random mistakes, but deliberate, consistent decisions that systematically disadvantaged black defendants. Terrence's narrative blended personal resilience with an exhaustive demonstration of law, procedure, and empirical evidence. Each fact, each document, each testimony reinforced the overarching story of injustice and vindication. By the conclusion of this section, the courtroom fully grasped the intersection of human cost, institutional corruption, and the extraordinary resolve required to reclaim his life. Every observer, from jurors to Whitfield herself, faced the undeniable truth. Terrence Robinson had survived not only a flawed legal system, but the deliberate erosion of fairness, and he had returned armed with both justice and humanity. Terrence shifted to the courtroom confrontation with Judge Whitfield. Calm and precise, he asked questions that exposed her inability to recall black defendants versus white defendants, her denial of due process, and her entanglement with political influence. Each question peeled back layers of institutional bias and deliberate misconduct. The gallery watched as a 30-year judicial career was laid bare, stripped of procedural pretenses and impartiality. Terrence presented the final affidavits and evidence linking systemic pressures to Whitfield's decisions. The courtroom was silent. The weight of truth settled heavily on everyone present. He described how each denial, each ruling, and each ignored motion had compounded, causing both personal and legal devastation. His methodical presentation forced Whitfield to confront the consequences of decades of deliberate actions that violated rights and manipulated outcomes. Every observer, from jurors to legal counsel, understood that this was more than a single case. It was a reckoning, a systematic exposure of a legal system capable of compounding human suffering through bias and negligence. Terrence's calm authority, combined with meticulous evidence, demonstrated not only his innocence, but the extraordinary resilience and intellect that had reclaimed his life from the edge of death row. Terrence then addressed the human consequences in vivid detail. He described the strain on his children and mother during his wrongful incarceration, the lost milestones, and the daily anguish of living under the shadow of a death sentence. Each narrative moment intertwined with legal evidence, illustrating how procedural violations inflicted tangible suffering. He connected the dots between judicial bias, political pressure, and systemic failure, showing how they culminated in a near-fatal miscarriage of justice. The courtroom felt the weight of every suppressed piece of evidence, every ignored motion, and every ruling that had favored expedience over fairness. Terrence highlighted how Whitfield's decades-long patterns had consistently disadvantaged black defendants, demonstrating a calculated, structural inequity. Every affidavit, lab report, and statistical analysis reinforced the narrative. By blending personal experience with meticulous legal argument, Terrence transformed the courtroom into a space of accountability. His calm, measured delivery made the evidence undeniable, compelling even the staunchest observers to confront the truth. Every moment underscored the interplay between human cost and systemic failure, culminating in the realization that this was not an isolated injustice, but a sustained pattern requiring redress and reflection. With the courtroom fully absorbed, Terrence shifted to the final pieces of evidence and testimony that would dismantle the illusion of fairness. He recounted every procedural failure, each untested piece of evidence, and the coerced testimony of Derek Sims. Each revelation underscored systemic bias and political interference. Terrence presented the independent DNA results, confirming Curtis Doyle's involvement, demonstrating that the original conviction was based on false assumptions and withheld evidence. He meticulously outlined the racial disparities in Judge Whitfield's sentencing record, connecting each data point to the broader pattern of injustice. The courtroom tension heightened as spectators, jurors, and even legal counsel absorbed the weight of decades of misconduct. Terrence's calm, deliberate presentation emphasized the human cost of these violations. The lost time with his children, his mother's anxiety, and the psychological burden of facing death row for a crime he did not commit. By the conclusion, every observer understood that they were witnessing not merely a legal appeal, but a profound confrontation with systemic corruption, bias, and the resilience of one man's pursuit of justice. The narrative was complete, compelling, and undeniable, leaving no space for dismissal or ignorance. Terrence then addressed the closure of the federal hearing. He explained the meticulous process by which he had assembled every piece of evidence, recast every affidavit, and meticulously cited every legal precedent, transforming his cell into a command center for justice. He detailed how each motion, each lab report, and each statistical analysis formed an unbroken chain, demonstrating judicial misconduct and systemic bias. The gallery, jurors, and attorneys were captivated, Unable to dismiss the clarity and precision of his work, Terrence illustrated the contrast between the cold procedural rulings of the original trial and the human consequences, lost time, fractured families, and psychological trauma. By tying personal experience to objective evidence, he forced the courtroom to recognize the full scope of injustice. Each element, the DNA, the recantation, the sentencing data, the affidavits, was presented not as isolated facts, but as interconnected evidence of a corrupt, biased system. The court understood that his advocacy was both precise and moral, revealing a depth of resilience and intellect that commanded recognition. Every observer, from Judge Abrams to Whitfield, felt the weight of decades of bias laid bare before them. Terrence Robinson had turned the courtroom into a stage of accountability, demonstrating the extraordinary power of knowledge, preparation, and moral clarity in confronting systemic injustice. Terrence began his closing argument with quiet authority. He addressed the courtroom directly, recounting the suffering endured by his children, his mother, and himself, weaving the human cost with the legal violations that had condemned him. Each procedural error, suppressed motion, and coerced testimony was linked to real-world consequences, making the systemic injustice tangible. He emphasized that Judge Whitfield's actions were not isolated mistakes, but part of a consistent pattern of bias against black defendants, with political and institutional pressures compounding the inequities. Terrence detailed how he had meticulously gathered evidence, coordinated witness recantations, and leveraged independent testing to expose the truth. His calm, precise voice commanded attention, and the courtroom absorbed the weight of decades of misconduct. By the conclusion, the narrative of systemic failure and personal resilience was undeniable. Every juror, attorney, and spectator understood that Terrence Robinson had endured not just wrongful conviction, but the full weight of an institution designed to perpetuate bias. The gallery was silent, the tension thick, as Terrence prepared to deliver the final transformative moments of the hearing, leaving nothing unexamined and every injustice accounted for. Terrence stood for his final statement, addressing everyone in the courtroom and those who would hear the story beyond its walls. He spoke of Alyssa and Marcus, the moments he had missed, and the daily sacrifices of his mother, Naomi. He tied each personal loss to the systemic injustice that had wronged him. Then, with measured clarity, he presented the outcome of his efforts. Judge Whitfield's 30-year pattern of bias exposed, Derek Sims's perjury revealed, Curtis Doyle identified as the true perpetrator, and all evidence of racial and procedural misconduct compiled. Terrence's conviction was vacated, all charges dismissed, and he was released to the embrace of his mother, standing at the prison gate as sunlight bathed them in a golden glow. He returned home, resuming family life, coaching Little League, and teaching legal literacy to inmates with humility and dedication. The consequences for the corrupt were swift. Whitfield disbarred and sentenced, political interference investigated, and several wrongful convictions overturned. Terrence's calm, deliberate actions had restored justice not only for himself, but for others affected by systemic failures. He concluded with a call to action: subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video. His story, a fusion of personal resilience, legal acumen, and unwavering moral clarity, became a testament to the power of knowledge and courage in confronting injustice.